Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dara. I'm the co-chair for the Pittsford PTSA Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Mark Diggory is my partner in crime, my other co-chair for this committee. We are meeting tonight to have a workshop or a discussion on the DASA, which is Dignity for All Students Act. And we are lucky and privileged to have both Dr. Shaun Nelms and our very own Dr. Pat Brogan with us tonight to talk about DASA. Dr. Shaun Nelms, if you don't know, is the director for the Center for Urban Education Success at University of Rochester's Warner School of Education. And Dr. Pat Brogan is the Director of Student Services and our District Dignity Act coordinator for Pittsford Central School District. So they're gonna talk and present for, anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. And then after that, we will answer questions that anybody might have. As the presentation is happening, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. If it's more, if it's a lengthier question with background and stuff like that, just let us know and we'll unmute you so that you can ask those questions. And as Mark said, this is being recorded, so you can view it later, or if someone couldn't make it, they can definitely hear it as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nelms.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for having me be a part of this conversation. And tonight is just going to be an opportunity for us to walk through DASA and some of the aspects for the act and how we could be proactive. And so we're going to focus on prevention being the goal. As stated, I wear several hats in the community. Probably the most important hat is father. I have kids who are, one who's exited high school and one who's entering her senior year and another who's entering the 8th grade. And so I hear a lot from school-age students about things that happen in school, things that happen to them personally. And so I'm very sensitive and empathetic to you all as parents. But I also wear the hat of a school administrator and understand that there are systems and structures in place that sometimes parents aren't aware of. And so hopefully today will be a bridge between me wearing my parent hat and my hat as a school superintendent with the University of Rochester's project with East High School. I also serve as director for the Center for Urban Education Success, or CUES. And the purpose of that center is to document best practices that can be shared with other urban settings, but also in rural and suburban schools also. On our website, there is a section that focuses on anti-bullying. And I believe today when we talk about bullying and we talk about restorative practices, you'll see that there is, from a prevention standpoint, schools must, and I'll talk about the efforts in Pittsford, schools must be proactive in their dealings with students who don't feel welcomed or feel harassed or bullied. And so at the end of this presentation, I'll be sure to show you where you can find resources on restorative practices, which is a process for restoring relationships among adults, students, and community, as well as an article that was co-written with Dr. Valerie Marsh, who I see is somewhere on this Zoom call, about how to create systems and structures in school that make them more welcoming and they support the behavioral health development of all students. And so we can avoid having to have reports through DASA. Pat, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Pat Vaughn Brogan, Director of Student Services. I have 2 graduates of Pittsford Central School District, so I've had the opportunity of having my children go through. And as a parent, you do learn things differently than you do as a school administrator, and I like to think it contributes to the work of the administrators when we're hearing these things from our own children and how they and their friends perceive their school climate and what's happening in school. I'm delighted to be here with all of you, happy to be also participating and learning with Dr. Nelms, and look forward to having a dialogue around this important topic. And as Shaun mentioned, prevention is definitely an area we all want to focus on, because when we get to the other side of it, children are uncomfortable and they're hurt, and we don't want that.
So to avoid death by PowerPoint, there are a ton of slides here, and I know that Mark is going to make those available for folks after this conversation. So I'm going to put as many slides in as possible so you can go ahead and reread or read deeper into what's stated. So I am not going to read from the slides, and I will probably run through a bunch of them more quickly than others, but I wanted you to have the entire deck. I also want to thank our friends at Bond and Scheck and King and attorney Bethany Centrone for helping to organize some of the slides that she's used in the past to train DASA trainers. And so our original PowerPoint was going to be from a deck that I use when teaching aspiring school administrators about DASA. But I think what I've heard from Mark and from Pat and others is a more detailed description of what schools must do, how schools should respond, and next steps was warranted. And so I switched gears maybe 2 days ago and decided I wanted to give a more in-depth overview of DASA. So I'm gonna get started, and I'm gonna say to you all that I cannot see the chat feature because my screen is in presenter mode. So if you're asking questions in chat, I won't be able to see them right away, but I'm encouraging to use the chat feature. And Pat is there, and Mark is there, and we'll be able to, that's what I see on my screen right now. And we'll be able to jump in. So this should be a fluid conversation. At the end, we'll leave some time for question and answers. I will also encourage you to the extent possible, to not personalize this for tonight. So if there are specific issues that you have that you've experienced in Pittsford, when we talk about that in the Q&A session, try to not, please identify the adults in the system, use general statements, and we can, or call Pat directly and she can talk to you about those things offline. But I just don't want this to be an opportunity to vent about our individual or specific concerns. And more importantly, I want us to kind of think about how do we address the issues of harassment and bullying from a preventative standpoint, but any of the things have to be reported. How do we do that so that all parties feel valued and heard and affirmed? When I say all, I mean the students involved, their parents, and the school community. So I want to just start with the next slide, which is just to remind you where this work is already being done in the Pittsford school system. So you'll see that, I want to make sure you guys can see my slides. Can you see that, Pittsford policy?
Yeah.
These are working? Okay, great. Policy 7552 in Pittsford has the following description. So if you're looking for board policies, you can go on their website, on the Board of Education site. You can put in, typically on most sites, the number, and they'll kind of underneath each of these topics will be a clear definition or resources. At the end of the presentation, I will also share a couple of school districts that I think have very engaging and interactive sites. One is Rush Henrietta. I think they do a really good job of creating links and resources for their community. And I use one from the east side, one from the west side also, Greece Central Schools. I think they have done a really good job of connecting DASA into the framework of their schools' proactive responses to bullying and harassment. So you'll see an emphasis on anti-bullying and anti-cyberbullying in the context of how do you do these things to prevent kids from feeling unprotected. And Pat, you can jump in anytime you want if I'm understating or overstating something.
No, good job.
The next I want to go through is just the guidelines. So New York State Education Department has some very clear guidelines in sections. Section 1 focuses on culture and climate. Again, if you're thinking about how to create a system where students feel valued and parents feel valued, there's a huge emphasis on culture and climate. And so at East, and what we've done at the University of Rochester CUES is really put a spotlight on student voice and empowerment. So what does that truly mean when students can dissent with their peers, but also dissent with adults in the system? What does it mean when the adults and kids have a similar context for what they're discussing? So for example, at East, we have 3 principles that we use. Principles Ellie, and that is to advocate for self and others and to think purposefully. And so when we think about how to advocate for self and others and how to think purposefully, what does that truly mean in an academic setting? What does that truly mean in when kids are at odds with one another? And so our conversations revolve around that, the restorative lens. And by doing that, we are setting a common definition and a common sense of accountability for culture and climate. So I would be thinking, if I were you on the call, like to what extent do we have common language for culture and climate? And if not, why not? And if so, how can we elevate that so that it's a shared accountability for all students? 2 would be creating an inclusive school community, and identifying that inclusive is not from a dominant standpoint, meaning that we're going to include you into our community, but how is that co-constructed so that everyone feels like they have say in the outcomes and decisions of the school, and that all kids feel respected and valued. And we'll talk about some of the categories of inclusivity a little bit later. Family and parent engagement is critical. When I talk about parent and family engagement, I think about when I was a school principal, I had teachers who were getting married and they would invite me to their weddings. And I wasn't foolish enough to not to think that they really wanted me there. They really wanted my gift. And so that's not a real authentic invitation. No one wanted me to see them dancing and getting inebriated on the dance floor, and nor did I want them to see me doing the same. So I think about, when we talk about an invitation, an authentic invitation, it's not the invitation to the wedding. It's truly engaging individuals when they get to the reception and making them feel like they're part of the family and are part of that special day. And so again, to what extent are families and parents authentically engaged in school settings? What are the systems in place that allow them to have proactive voices in decisions, but also to be able to share those decisions and the rationale, if they agree or not, with the broader community? And then 6, what we talk about is, the state talks about restorative approaches and progressive discipline. So there are times which an event will occur and parents want it to go from point A to point D quickly, and we have to have progressive steps towards that. There's sometimes it's warranted to go from point A to point D. But what is the progressive discipline? What does it look like? And then more importantly, what are we doing to make sure that the event doesn't happen again, and that all parties involved, if it's 2 kids or a bunch of kids, understand the harm that they cause, and they're able to resolve that. Now, some would say, how many times do my kids have to be hit before the other kids realize that hitting is bad? So again, it's on a continuum, and how schools deal with that changes, and how school administrators respond to it can be situational also. So our job as school leaders is to make sure that we are as aligned as we can be, that there's some inner rater agreement around what's a level 2 or a level 4, but we also give grace, that knowing that each kid is different, each situation is different, and sometimes our relationship with the parents or the families will dictate how quickly we move from one level to the next, or sometimes we go backwards if kids are making adequate progress. So I'm going to walk you through today a bunch from in each of those sections, and we'll go from there. Just checking my pace. Is that a good pace, Pat?
Yes, I think so. Can I add one comment here?
Or absolutely.
Just talking about part of the presentation goal is really looking at prevention. And when you look at these sections of the guidance, 1, 2, and 5 really are mechanisms to create a culture and climate in which we can more successfully prevent bullying and harassment. And then 6 helps us deal with it when it does occur. So those first several sections are really important in looking at the climate.
Absolutely. Yep. So the next we're going to talk about this. So this is, again, I chose this particular PowerPoint or modified it because I wanted to make sure that you as parents have an idea of how DASA trainers might be trained in this work. So if and when there's a disagreement or a misunderstanding about why decisions are being made, at least you're thinking from a common context. So what we typically tell school personnel is that your responsibility is to report, and reporting is not telling. All right, it's not tattletelling. It's not like you are whistleblowing or you're a snitch. Like, it's your responsibility to make sure that students are listened to and that complaints are reported, and that you truly understand what discrimination and bullying are, so you can take those matters seriously. And you'll hear me say throughout the entire presentation that we have to affirm and validate the concerns being brought to us as DASA reporters, so that no single child feels like their situation or their experience is less of a priority. And sometimes we have to take those things seriously also, because a kid may complain to separate adults. And if those issues don't rise to one central space, then we may see one incident as being singular, or for that kid and that family, it could be it could be a multiplied effect. So as a school, we have to do our due diligence to make sure we listen, we document, we follow through, and we have to make sure that if there is mediation or counseling, conflict resolution needed, that we address it appropriately without the individuals feeling targeted or feeling like their complaints did not rise to the right level of concern. So DASA, the Dignity for All Students Act, has some general requirements. One is that no student shall be subjected to bullying or harassment. And I think for years, schools struggled with what constitutes bullying or harassment. Is it a ton of different issues? How many? And so the state became much more clear with their definition, saying that, like, basically it's better to over-report than to under-report. Because the minute that you start to under-report and you make subjective decisions, you're going to marginalize a subset or a group of individuals. And that's not something that we seek to do. And that way, in each school setting, there has to be someone held responsible for addressing complaints. And what I say to individuals, and Bonachek says also, when that someone is you, anyone who is responsible for supporting a student, it's their responsibility to address the complaints. Either it's addressing it as a DASA coordinator or addressing the issue to the DASA coordinator or someone who has that authority. To sit idle and say, well, it's not my responsibility is no longer acceptable. And the state has made that abundantly clear. So at the end of the presentation, I believe there are slides that show in Pittsford who those individuals are that are responsible for reporting. So some of the common definitions, we talk about harassment happening within a school environment. That's buildings, it's playgrounds, it's school buses, it's social media now. It's wherever kids are gathered for a school-sponsored event. So the minute that you leave your house and come to school, that's not like free bully zone. And then when you leave school and go home, that's not free bully zone. It's when kids are engaged in meaningful activity that's sponsored by the school, that's it. This could also extend itself to the PTA. So I know we often say, well, PTA's event is not a school event, but if we are aware that we're having our kids and we're publicizing the events for our kids through an organization like PTA, and we know that bullying and harassment is taking place, we can't ignore that and say that's their issue, not ours, right? The minute that it's on our school property, an event that we help sanction, we help promote, then we have to assume that we have some liability towards maintaining a healthy and caring school environment. And when we talk about the definition of harassment means the creation of a hostile environment. That could be verbal, it could be physical, it can be intimidation. You know, sometimes it could be a kid walking down the hallway and the same kids are staring at him or her or murmuring under their breath racial terms or homophobic slurs. Like, those things are all part of harassment if they're continual. And we have to make sure that if it's substantially interfering with someone's educational performance, it's harassment. Now, again, the subjectivity comes in there is, well, what's substantially interfering? If a kid feels like they're being interfered, we have to take it seriously. We can't say, well, the kids are just playing in dozens, or the kids will just be kids. We have to, the state encourages us and warns us if we don't do that, we're setting ourselves up for disaster. So, you know, again, if my child is constantly coming home crying and saying I'm feeling harassed and bullied, and I call the school principal and the principal says, well, you know how Johnny is. Johnny just plays with everyone. It's not about your son. He does it to every kid. That's not an acceptable answer. All right. And they have a responsibility to follow through and to create some type of corrective action and some remediation. And remember, if you reported to a school and you don't feel like your concern is being elevated, parents also have a right to fill out the DASA form on the state website. So you can directly report to the state if you feel like you're being unheard, but we do encourage you to work with the school system first, because the issue that you're having, if the school's able to fix it, it may be able to fix that for other students also. So it's about the entire school community. Sometimes working through an issue in detail will help prevent future acts from occurring. But I don't want you to leave this presentation thinking that if the school doesn't do anything, you don't have another option. Your option is to go directly to the state and go on our website and do it yourself. Harassment, again, is not limited to It includes, but not limited to, conduct, verbal threats, intimidation. We talked about that a little bit. Weight was emphasized, I think in 2012 was updated, I believe. But perceived race, weight, national origin. I mean, you think about local politics, Kamala Harris gets elected, nominated for the VP or chosen, and immediately you're seeing these smear campaigns about, well, is she really Black because she has some Indian descent? And her parents came from Jamaica. Does that really mean that she has, the American experience? Like, if that's a student and I'm walking the classroom and I'm half Indian, identify as half Indian and half Black, and I'm constantly hearing from teachers and from kids that that I'm not who I think I am, who I perceive myself as, then that could become a harassing situation. And so to be proactive, I'm thinking about how do I help the school community better understand that as a candidate, she is a biracial, self-identified biracial candidate, and what does that truly mean? So when kids are having conversations, they're not saying things that that could become harassing in nature. So that's a proactive way of dealing with that, right? It's not promoting a candidate over the other. It's saying, hey, we have a national person for the presidency, and their racial, their perceived race or their racial identification is something we should talk about, because it talks about the complete fabric of the country. It doesn't have to take that kid being harassed for that conversation to take place. As school systems, we can be a little bit more proactive and be more strategic in how we deal with certain issues that we can predict might occur in our schools based on past behaviors of students. If I know in my school that racial conversations take place and certain kids are marginalized because they identify as biracial, and I don't do anything now that we have a national figure, then shame on me. So I have an opportunity to be proactive and to think about those things. And some of those things will surface if you have good relationships with your parents and your school community. Harassment is, then we talk about bullying as a different form. And bullying, the state emphasizes aggressive behavior. So it's intentional. So tripping, pushing, it's an abuse of power, if you will. And they define it under 3 categories: positional. So they have a place of there, you have a person who is in a position of power. So team captain, employee. It's a social thing, so trying to be cool. So it's to gain the bully social favor. Or extortion, taking their lunch money or taking their sneakers or what the case may be. Having the kid not ever be picked, and because they want to show them that they're the least athletic on the team. Wherever the case may be, we have to look for issues of bullying. Cyberbullying is something that I mentioned earlier and something that we wrote about through Q's. And again, thank Dr. Marsh for working on an incredible article about cyberbullying. But cyberbullying was defined in DASA as harassment that occurs in any form of electronic communication. I can remember when I was an administrator, we didn't talk about cyberbullying because there was no clear definition about it. We weren't sure what this whole social media thing was about. And I'm happy now that there's more clear guidance around that, and we can hold kids accountable for social media posts, emails, text messaging, blogs, etc. Even if they try to obscure the kid's name, everyone in school understands what it is. If it causes a severe disruption in school, it's considered cyberbullying. So here's some examples from regulation. Reports are based on person's actual perceived race. I talked about it a little bit. Denial of access to school facilities and functions. You see some of those things. Application of a dress code. We talk about how in some schools they're having certain kids cut their hair, their dreadlocks, and saying that is against school policy. That's being challenged in the courts right now because it's a form of harassment from an adult to a kid's situation. The use of names, other harassment, and forms of bullying. So let's say you have been violated, or there's been a situation in which someone claims harassment or bullying. Then there is a complaint process. There are several forms that are used. There's a student harassment form that's used to kind of screen the complaints, meaning that this is where the DASA reporter or the school administrator would be thinking about, does this rise to the level of a DASA complaint form? I think this is where many parents have concerns with school districts across the country because they feel like they screen them down to a level that doesn't rise to harassment or bullying. And they say, well, because it's kids are horse playing, then it doesn't rise to the DASA complaint form. And I think schools have to be very clear at this step in the process. So as a PTA or a parent organization, I would be asking, if I was talking to any PTA, I would be asking for clarity around the screening process and how is it determined and dictated. And as a parent, if it were my kid, I would make sure I'm keeping a log of the times that my kids came home and said this kid's bothering them. So that, again, it may be to the school administrator or the DASA coordinator a singular complaint, because that's the only thing that's risen to their level, when the kid could have complained to 10 different staff members. But that's also part of the investigation process. It's my responsibility to say, hey, Shaun has complained about being called the N-word several times. Has anyone heard this? You know, any of his teachers heard this? A couple teachers say, yeah, I heard something. It sounded like it. I wasn't certain. Then I'm asking, why didn't you report that? You know, and then there's more deeper conversations and questions. So part of the screening process is doing your due diligence to find out if this rises to the level of harassment or bullying. Then there's a complaint form, there's an investigation form, and then the final form is kind of the remediation form. So the safety student plan, mediation, restorative practices, restorative protocols, et cetera. Pat, you want to talk about any processes in Pittsford that relate to this that people should know, or should I keep going?
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, but any incident that's reported is investigated and follows essentially this whole process, even if it is not deemed a DASA eligible incident that would be either reported or other things done with. So when anyone fills out an incident report form, whether it's a student, staff member, parent, etc., it goes through the investigation process.
There's another nuance too that I think parents may not be aware of, and sometimes we may not articulate well as school administrators, is that when you have multiple issues within the same infraction, let's say there's hitting, a weapon, and a racial slur, that you typically report the one that has the most severe penalty. And so what happens sometimes is, if it's my child, well, let's not say weapon, let's say there's pushing, a racial slur, and name calling, a different type of name calling, right? And I think as a parent that the racial slur is the most hurtful and harmful thing, but the school sees the physical push as being that. I'm saying, no, the emotional pain for my son, he'll get over the push, but the emotional pain he's gonna deal with it calling it. If the school and the parent don't come to some agreement and have a conversation around what's important, then sometimes parents feel like the school is not reporting the right infraction. So as a parent, you have a right to say in the conversation that I want this particular issue stated in the complaint form, because now that doesn't mean the school has to do it, but you have a voice and you should be able to say to individuals, this is what I deem as important, and I don't want this to not be, I don't want this particular infraction to not mention race, because I don't want it to be minimized. And so, and that becomes district by district and situational. So I think it's really important that that the school articulates why certain things are on the forms and when they're not. And the parent also is given the opportunity to articulate what's most harmful to them. And so that becomes the preventative, proactive aspects of this work. And again, I think I saw a hand raised pop up on my screen. I'm just gonna ask us, I'm gonna get to these slides in about, say, 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. So if you have a question, just hold it there. The complaint, I'll go quick, I'm gonna speed up a little bit. The incident does not, okay, so reporting incident does not need to be reported to be actionable. So if you see it, you hear it, you document it. So, you know, if I walk down the hallway and I see a kid being harassed and no one's reported it to me, I can't just ignore it. You know, you have to deal with it. Some of the immediate things are happening at the classroom level, and more serious things happen at the with the coordinator. Now, what's important here is that second bullet. Teachers have to better understand what's minor and what's major. And so that becomes the training that all teachers have to receive. Pat was just telling me before this call that there's some new video or a PowerPoint deck that came out to help for teacher training, to make sure they understand that what's minor to them may be a major to the kid and their family. And I know, I'm just gonna, again, because my own kids' experience was best to use that. I know that there have been times in which racial slurs have been used, And I was upset that it wasn't elevated to the point that it should be. Because for me, having my kid hear something for the first time as a middle schooler has a lifetime impact on him. So to me, that's major. If he gets pushed, that's not so major, you know? So you have to be clear about those things and make sure that you help educate the school around those things that are important. And that teachers understand that, you know, calling someone a female slur or racial slur or homophobic slur is not minor, and that it should be taken seriously and acted upon. Even if in the end, there was a misunderstanding about what was used, it's their responsibility to report it and elevate it. Social media, if employees become aware of any harassment or bullying by one student to another, they have to report it. So again, a kid comes in Monday morning and says, "Oh my God, I can't believe that Johnny sent a naked picture of Susie," and a teacher can say, "Oh, put your phones away." Like, you have to report that, you know, or, you know, so teachers have to be really, 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 really diligent in making sure they report things that are happening. And again, I'll keep saying this too, it's better to over-report than to under-report. And I know that there's always a fear that as a district, if I over-report, we're gonna get our report card on DASA, it's gonna look bad. I think that's the least of your worries if some kid goes home and takes their life because they've been bullied. And we find out that you've been told about this kid hurting him and herself for 5 months and you did nothing. So I always say to them, the backlash on over-reporting, it fails in comparison if a kid hurts themselves or hurts someone else because they've been bullied and nothing has been done. And the reality is, if we know that the reporting is accurate, then you can have a more progressive response to those actions moving forward. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to hide it because it's going to bubble and blow at some point anyways. Again, the complaint is best completed by the complaining student or parent. So that means you sit down, you have a conversation, you ask a lot of questions. Student teachers, administrators, and DASA coordinators should be asking questions, not making judgments. I'm a huge Criminal Minds fan. My daughter and I watch the episode every night through COVID. And we're always like, we're amazed at how the individuals, the officers, ask questions to get, you know, people to elicit their true feelings and their perspective, even having them close their eyes and saying, "Hey, tell me how you felt in this moment." Like, in this moment, we are as much of a counselor as we are an investigator, making people feel comfortable enough to share, because there are times in which students don't want to share or parents don't want to share because they don't feel like the complaints can be taken seriously or they're truly embarrassed. And so to what extent do we make parents feel comfortable enough to share and we get it right directly from the person and not through hearsay? The investigation continues through DASA. How to conduct that? Again, you want to do it as quick as possible. You don't want it to linger. You want to be protective and understanding of FERPA and making sure that you protect the innocent or the accused, and the accused and the accuser. You protect them both in this process. That parents of the accused student might have a right under FERPA to be informed of what's happening. You can't guarantee confidentiality, but you can do your best. What that means is, if a student comes to me and tells me they were sexually harassed, I can't keep that confidential. I have to go to the authorities and to the proper people. So you don't want to say that anything you tell me won't be shared, because if it's something that's harmful, you have to share that. And so there are times which parents will have an understanding that what they're sharing is going to be held confidential, and then an administrator will reveal that and they feel like they've broken their trust. So just know that if a parent were to reveal something of serious nature, that it has to be reported. We're mandated reporters, and we have to make sure that kids are protected. Even if parents, I always tell folks in classes, if a parent tells you something that's that serious, they really want you to say something. That's the approach that I take, you know, and they'll understand and they'll forgive you later on if it saves their child's life, or it saves their family, or it saves, you know, another student. We talked about that. Teachers and administrators are not supposed to go around and blab about, the second bullet on here, blab about what they were told. Can you believe that Miss, you know, Brogan came to me, Dr. Brogan came to me and she said AA about her child? I can't believe that. If that employee has nothing to do with the information of the case, I'm not telling my clerical work, my support work, I'm not telling the administrator who's includes 3 grade levels removed. You're really supposed to keep that information on a need-to-know basis, and that will allow you to gather as much information to respond as quickly as possible. Are there going to be times where you share with something thinking they have valuable information? Possibly, but that should not be the default. It should be a relatively confidential situation. All right, the investigation form. Conducting the investigation, student first, interview witnesses, interview the accused, interview additional witnesses, and that's sometimes number 4 is where rumors start to happen. There's a bunch of kids, so they say, well, Johnny, Sue, and Mary heard that. You can't go on a witch hunt and ask 20 kids about an incident. You have to do your due diligence to find out. And if you need to get to that level, then you may need additional people to help support the investigation. But typically, you want to have as small of a circle as possible during the investigation, so that critical information is not leaked and or kids aren't wrongfully accused or embarrassed by what they information they provided. Do you have your hand raised?
I think what's real important is recognizing that the farther out you extend that, if there were 20 students that saw this, that negates some of the confidentiality and may be very harmful to the individual students. So really doing that initial investigation with the primary reporters first, I think is critical.
So I would say, so think about this. So a parent might say, I can't believe they didn't, I told them that my son was harassed and these 5 kids heard it. And they're not even asking those 5 kids. And I called their parents and their parents heard it too. Like, allow the process to take shape. If in the end you feel like there wasn't enough information shared, then at that point, bring them in. But the more that parents get involved in the interview process, the less reliable at times the information becomes. Mm-hmm. If you have something that's important, then you also as a parent have a right to say, I know these 2 kids directly heard it because their parents called me, and I'm requesting that you speak to these 2 kids at the appropriate time. So again, I think where this works best is when there's an established relationship between the school, the parent, and the kid, so that we can have some very thoughtful and honest and sometimes courageous conversations about process, but also that the parent knows I'm going to do my best to investigate, and I know the parents are going to give me some time to do that. Now, it only takes a couple times for that trust to be broken, so you have to be clear around the process too, and sometimes providing check-ins with the parent to say, we're in day 2 of this. We've talked to several kids. I want you to know that we're still investigating. How is Johnny doing? I'm going to check on him at the end of the day today and get him on his bus. We are taking this seriously, and I'll have an update for you by Friday. That constant communication becomes very valuable. And as parents, you should be demanding that. If you have a meeting with the DASA coordinator and you say, listen, it's Monday, say, can we check in on Wednesday for an update? Can we check in on Thursday for an update? And that should be a mutually agreed upon time that gives them time to investigate, but also gives you an opportunity to relax a little bit, to really think through and process with your child, and then have a follow-up conversation. Because often these things become very heated. All right, so I'm going to skip through a bunch of the next slides, but you can look at them for yourselves. There's interviews, what the DASA coordinator should be asking, and how they should be introducing themselves. The interview itself, I'm not going to go through. I already talked about this, my criminal minds analogy. Tell what happened, get the facts, try not to lead and steer kids to your own desired path. Definitely don't try to convince the kid that nothing's wrong. Make sure you check the demeanor. Is the kid looking suicidal? What does suicidal look like? I don't know. But the kid is like sitting there cutting themselves with a pencil, or if a kid is sitting there crying uncontrollably, like you elevate that with school counseling. You want to check in with the parents. You want to figure these things out. But you have to look for telltale signs, and not every administrator is trained to do that. In fact, most of us are not. But you have to do your best as a prudent parent to ensure that you are looking at how kids might respond. The closing of this is you close out the process. Again, the last bullet I already jumped to, you give an estimated timeline for completion of the investigation with frequent checks in between. This would be good practice. You start to interview witnesses. We talked about that. You want to minimize the number of witnesses that are there. I'm just going fast. I don't get to the questions. You start with very generic questions about the student. You document the demeanor of that student. Can you tell if they're lying or not? Again, what does that look like when the kid is fidgeting? I can tell you this. Most educators are pretty good at dictating or determining when kids are not telling the truth, because it's not the first kid who sat in front of us and didn't tell the truth. So if you ask the questions the right way, and again, if you have a relationship with the student, Students will typically crack after a while. The witnesses, the same process. So I'm just giving you all the different things in case you want to see this later. This is the accused. You cannot, you have to be very careful not to indict the accused based on reporting. They have a right to have their side of the story shared as well. They have a right to defend themselves and to, sometimes it's sheer bullying harassment, they're doing it intentionally. And sometimes it's sheer ignorance. All right, I'll give you a great example of that. My next door neighbor years ago, he was probably 7 years old. My son and I were outside and in the front yard, and he looked over. He must have been learning about slavery in school, young kid. He goes, "Mom, Dad, is that a slave?" Right? So of course, the mom turns beet red, grabs her son. I said, "No, Renee, stop." I said, "No, Jack." I said, "What are you learning about in school?" And we talked about it. That kid wasn't being offensive. He had no idea what he was saying. But that same kid made the same comment in school to another student. And the student he said it to was very knowledgeable about slavery because they had learned about it in their household since their birth. It doesn't mean that kid's being a racist. It means that there's an opportunity to help correct the behavior for the kid who said it, help educate them on that, and also to affirm the kid who knew about his history to say, thank you for helping him understand what you're not, and then calling both parents and letting them know what happened, right? That may not rise to a level of a DASA issue, so it's always contextualized. If the same thing happened with two high school seniors, it might be a completely different outcome because there is a presumed understanding that a senior in high school would know that their classmate is not a slave, and to go tell them to pick cotton is not a slip up of their understanding. It can be deemed intentional. So there is a degree of subjectivity in that, but the communication, how you circle back, becomes critical. Looking at time, it is 7:48. I said I want to be done by about 8 o'clock, so I'm on pace. And then the complaint process, the determination. So at what point is this a single act of teasing or name calling and likely not harassment? That depends on the degree to which the conduct affected one's education. So you have to decide, like, to what extent did this really impact the academic and educational environment for the student? Look at the type and frequency. It does not have to happen 10 times for it to rise to the level of harassment or bullying, but you have to be able to justify why it has not risen, and also why it has. The location incident and the context in which it occurred, you should talk about. So let's say this is my 10th issue and it happened all in the boys' locker room. Then as a school, systemically, what are we doing to prevent kids from being harassed in the school locker room? You can't just say, well, there's no cameras in there and kids are changing, what can I do? No, it's the school's responsibility to have kids going in smaller groups or to separate them across. Whatever the structures that you put in place is your responsibility to take what's learned in the investigation and make corrective actions. Often you hear, oh, kids are being kids, or it's a he said, she said situation. You have to look at credible determinations. And you have to understand, is someone constantly lying? Is this the 5th time that this kid has been caught in a lie about these claims? But it doesn't mean that the 6th time they say it, it hasn't happened. So you can't just assume that they're lying again. You have to investigate it. At the same sense, you have to make sure that you are understanding the credibility of the witness. And that doesn't mean a good kid from a bad kid, a straight A student is better believed than a D student. That can't be a determination. It has to be what they present, how they articulate themselves, and what your investigation comes away with. Because one would argue that perhaps a kid is a D student because they've been harassed so much they've given up on school. If they were in a caring environment, perhaps they would be an A student as well. So you have to be really careful about that. This is the DASA or not DASA, that is the question. You have to look at the substantial interfering and what's reasonable. And again, a kid running down the hallway and a kid trips over their feet, is that necessarily harassment, or did the kid actually not see the kid running down the hallway, right? And so you have to figure those things out also. Or if the video shows the kid literally put his leg out, then you don't have to investigate with 20 kids and he put his leg out if you watch the kid do it on tape. But the investigator has to do their due diligence to actually go identify the tape, look at the location, and try to figure out if there's any evidence that might help. I'm gonna skip over the examples and just tell you that both could be forms. Documentation is crucial. And I'm gonna say that's from the school's perspective, and as a parent, you have an opportunity, an obligation to ask them for their documentation. What have you seen? What have you investigated? They might not be able to show you everything. We may not be able to because some of it may be protected. But we can say to you that, if we looked at 30 emails from 10 students where your child claimed that they were sharing, this type of content, and on 10 of the phones we saw nothing, or we looked at their school Chromebook and the article that you said they wrote about your child, we have a copy of that. And in no way, we looked at the history. We had our IT department look at the history to see if anything was erased. Nothing was stated. So we, at this point, we come to the conclusion that if it did happen, it's no longer there. But we did our due diligence to figure out. And at this point, we can have a conversation with the student about writing fictional articles that may be contextualized in your child's experience. Like, there's some things we can't resolve, but we can plant the seed for that kid to say, if you do this again, then we know that we're on to you now, if you will. The remediation becomes important. I think schools having a consistent approach towards anti-bullying, anti-cyberbullying, restorative practices is important. It should not. So I always said this: when at EASE, when we adopted a restorative practice process, I used to always talk about it, and then I would say, "Here's restorative practice," and then the next slide I would say, "We reduced suspensions by 85% in the first year." So I was failing to put restorative practice as an anti-suspension drug. That's the wrong thing to do. I no longer do that. I talk about restorative practice in its own bucket around establishing, restoring, and maintaining relationships. So what are we doing in our daily practice to do that? Suspensions become a result of a positive culture and climate or restorative climate where you might see suspensions decrease. So what I would say to you is, I would challenge as parents, or at least question, challenge is not an adversarial term, to question, to challenge, to make clear, what is our plan around creating environments that are conducive to students feeling safe and cared for, and that they feel and have the opportunity to voice when that environment does not exist. And that just may be where you put your energy to start, is developing an authentic, safe space for kids and families. That does not mean the showy, shiny object you throw at it, or you say, we're going to do this cool thing to address race or this. That doesn't work. It has to be ingrained in the culture of the building. It's got to be created, sustained, maintained over time, where people can check back into common language and common understanding for moving forward. As I said earlier, we do advocate for self and others. We think about being proactive, and we think about all these Covey principles. Covey is a place that a lot of schools, Leader in Me work, people kind of anchor themselves into there. Others create their own principles and guidelines around this work. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to a shared understanding between students, parents, and the school community. Liability, schools can be liable. Although there is no direct liability under DASA, it creates a duty for districts to do. And so that's what I'm saying. It's better to over-report than underreport, because parents can always file a civil lawsuit in court. So you want to avoid that by doing what's right for kids. This should not be a process to not be sued. This should be a process to be preventative in how we support and care for our children and our staff. Again, I just share some other liability things here. You can read that for those who are all into legalities of the work. That the reporting obligations, that it has to be reported annually. And there's a school report card that is a report on schools, like our report card on this work. Each school's report is made public. You can access that easily. It's often, I think it has to be posted on a school's website or made accessible to parents. I believe that's what the law says. If not, it's a good practice to have that, a link to that, so parents don't have to search for it. The reporting obligation, they have to report the incidents. They can't minimize those things. If you feel like your issue has been minimized or marginalized, you have a right to report directly to the state. I have 4 more minutes and we'll get to the questions. This gives an example or definition for what material incident is. You can look through that. Talked about that, about single versus a series. Just as a reminder, the and reporting categories we went through earlier in the presentation, but I just did it as a reminder here. the data collection is here. There's some links to the state guidelines. There's some bully prevention resources that have been made. I'll give you access to. And then just returning back to the Pittsford policies that Pat started with. And I just want Pat to kind of end with some of the district goals that Pittsford has, that just to kind of remind people that there are DASA goals and work that's being done. On the next slide, Pat, is a social and emotional learning initiative that I can share also if you want.
Okay, that'd be great, because that's so much a part of culture and climate, to develop that climate where kids are safe enough to report their concerns, and that the climate itself is one in which we hope will reduce those types of issues that we're talking about. These are the folks at each of the buildings who are responsible. There are Dignity Act coordinators. I'm the district coordinator, and each of these folks are at the building, and that's where someone can make a report. They can do it online, do it in person, send us an email, give us a call, etc. And all of those will be taken a look at through that. We really incorporate this into our social, emotional, and learning initiatives, and thought with purpose, try to implement activities and goals within the buildings that are going to try to foster this type of climate. Some of you will know that we're working on the data analysis with our climate survey, and that's going to be very informative for us going forward. We also have to look at how this new school world is going to impact everyone when we get into September. And some children are in school, some are at home, some are hybrid, etc. And I think there are a lot of DASA type things to look at with that as well. This is just some of the examples of the activities going on in the district that have a purpose related to culture and climate and DASA. And again, and certainly at another time we can go into a lot of these if folks are interested in. But there is this web of understanding that what we do in many of our activities in school may seem an isolated activity, but they're woven together from a climate perspective and a prevention perspective as well. Shaun, you talked just a little bit about relationships, and that piece is so critical. The relationships that students have with staff are really important, and hopefully they will see their trusted adult there, that if they do need to share information, something that's bothering them or something has happened, that those connections are there so that students can report. And then also relationships with each other, right? The better the student relationships, the less likely there are that these bullying, harassment, etc. would take place. And the next one, we just wanted to put some information in there, knowing that we're coming to talk to our diversity and inclusion committee of the PTSA, looking at ways to help adults in a school system understand what they can do to be mindful of not only the culture and climate that we're developing, but how to respond when something does happen. And that's a real important component of, it's actually an important component of prevention as well as of intervention. I also just wanted to say, and I'm hoping that the participants tonight recognize that the slides that Shaun's shared that are used in training administrators and training folks who will be Dignity Act coordinators, that's really important information. So not only is the legal component of it important, but also how to talk to our students when they're reporting something, how to validate their concerns, and how to work with families in order to come to the best resolution. Those are real important pieces, and anyone who's a DASA coordinator has to participate in those types of things.
And I'm going to I included for you all some examples of local school districts and some of their sites. And so again, as a parent group, perhaps if you see a model that's used locally or nationally that provides more information, I think again, the relationship model is working with Pat and her team or whoever, whoever's listening in your local districts to like maybe modify the website so it's more parent friendly, and then the PTA can link that same site to their page. But I just provide a bunch of links. The RHNet is Rush Henrietta, then you have Greece, and there's one here for Fairport also. So I think just some different ideas and examples of how to identify some, which I thought were some pretty good examples. I kind of just went around with the certain districts really quickly. All right, we're here to the question and comment. So I got it done. It is 8. What is it? 8, 2 after 8. So I'm 2 minutes over, but I think we started a little late. So I hope that wasn't death by PowerPoint, but I really wanted to give you enough slides that will allow you to go back and think about these things later on. After the Q&A, I will show you those anti-bullying and restorative practices websites from the Q's website. I want to get to the Q&A first, and I'll end with that.
Yeah, that'd be nice. There's some nice things there.
All right. So we do have a list of questions. We're going to start with Sarah, who's been patiently waiting with her hand raised. So I'm going to unmute so she can ask her question. I don't know.
Sarah, thank you for being patient. I really wanted to get to that PowerPoint, and I could not see anyone who was raising their hands or talking, so because my screen was full of images.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize that my hand was raised, so I don't have a question. I apologize.
All right, so then let's see. Our next question came from Jen Canning. It says, does the definition of harassment and what should be reported get into the nuance of microaggressions, such as continuing to mispronounce a student's name, etc.? Things that might be seen as not intentionally hurtful, but repeatedly happen.
So I would answer that by saying, if you look at the last two slides before that, Pat was talking about, I think, the diversity slide, I believe. They had microaggressions in that, one of those bulleted lists. I almost highlighted it. That's why it's on my mind. So I would say that I think the intention, so saying a kid's name wrong may not be enough to rise to a DASA reporting issue, but I think it's a form of disrespect to the student if you've been told repeatedly how to not say it, how to say it correctly, you continue to do it. So if it's an adult that continues to do it and they refuse to change their mind because the word is too difficult or the name is too difficult, then that's problematic. Can it rise to the point where I'm going to make this up? Someone's name is Biscuit, and I keep calling them Bisquick as a teacher, and I keep doing that over and over and over again, and now kids are calling them Bisquick, and the kid feels, that was a pretty good, and the kids start feeling offended by that, then yeah, I would say it could rise to the point of harassment because they've been corrected. The teacher is initiating this Bisquick nickname the kid doesn't want. They've told them they don't want it. And the teacher keeps saying, just get over it. Or a kid keeps doing the same thing. You know, oh, you're a Bisquick. And they keep doing it over and over again. Absolutely. I think that rises to the level. I don't know that specific example, but that's how I would answer that. So yeah, those microaggressions are incredibly important. And I think, again, if teachers are often the first line of defense for these issues, to what extent are we educating teachers to recognize microaggressions in ways that lead for corrective action in the moment, because it's supposed to be corrected in the moment whenever possible, but then to prevent it from happening in the future. And if everyone's on the same page with that common definition understanding, then the kids will see the support happening their 8-9 periods out of the day, and not just when they get to Miss Sarah's classroom, who's the only one who supports the initiative or who corrects the behavior, I should say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
So the next question was, if a student reports an incident to a teacher and an admin, would that be 2 forms of the incident report, or is it just one that eventually gets combined by the 2 people that the student reported it to?
Well, the way it would depend on if it's the same incident. So if they reported the same incident to 2 different people, then it's one incident they're reporting on. Now,
and it could be that the teacher submitted an incident, the administrator found out about it as well and was submitting an incident. If I was the administrator, I'd be looking at that together as one incident and tracking that.
So I guess like this is my question. So as a follow-up, would it be that they should be doing it, like that both people should be filling out the form, not knowing that the student has complained to 2 different people?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. And then if it gets to the DASA coordinator and they see it's one complaint, then it's, they, you know, and again, that's all part of the investigation too. It may only get reported once, and then I go to the teachers and say, hey, has anyone heard this? And then the teacher says, yeah, I heard it too. Then you can document that as additional information. Now, again, does that rise to the level, depending on the infraction, does that rise to the level of harassment or bullying? Possibly, possibly not. It depends on what's said, the frequency, the severity of it, what was actually spoken. So all those things come into play. But yeah.
But a piece of that too, Shaun, and I think you mentioned it when you were presenting, is if that staff member did not bring it to the attention of the administrator, whether that's through the formal paperwork or coming to the administrator and saying, boy, I just have this information that I want to give to you, then we have to look at that from that training perspective, right? Because we all have that duty and responsibility to take that next step.
Thank you for that one. And then the other question too is with remote learning and hybrid learning, there's a higher potential for cyberbullying now. Are there ways that we can prevent this? Have we thought that far ahead?
Yes, netiquette. How to help kids with their netiquette. We are having conversations about that, and there's becoming a little bit more in the literature and research around helping kids with that. Shaun, do you have things you're working on with your students?
Yeah, I mean, and
it's
again,
a tough one.
I want to be clear. I think that being preventative and proactive is best. So we've done a lot of work in the past around, so we have, all our kids have Chromebooks, they have Google accounts. And so we can see what's being written and things like that. So there's a way of monitoring. We're not spying on our kids, there's no way. But there's ways for us, since they're on district platforms, to see if harassment is happening or not, or to what extent that it's happening. So, I mean, I think for us, we haven't experienced a ton of cyberbullying in school. I would also say that we collect cell phones at the beginning of the day at East, something I was completely against, but the kids and parents and staff wanted it. And we know that a lot of the cyberbullying has been minimized because the kids can't do it during the school day, you know, and sending things to one another. So
it's
we
interesting.
reported that the culture and climate is much better because they don't have the social media available to be harassing towards one another.
And I also think it's for the hybrid situation or the remote learning situation, making sure the expectations for the behavior, so the kids are very aware of what the expectations are. And the same thing, we're on district platforms, et cetera. There are ways to identify, but you don't want that to be the reason, right? You want to be able to say the prevention of that is the goal.
Yeah. So that kind of leads into the next question was, how are DASA and its rights and responsibilities introduced to students in school or in the classroom?
Well, I'll talk about ours and Shaun can talk about his. We, part of the law is you have to have developmentally or age appropriate ways that the students receive this information. So at the elementary school, there's more pictorial information and activities around behavior that's related to DASA and bullying, who they can talk to if they have a question, if they're younger children may not be filling out the form. Older students are part of their opening ceremonies and class talks, as well as written documents and student handbooks, all of those types of things.
I put in the chat, and again, if we have time, I'll show at the end, but that's a link to Restorative Practices page. If you look at on the right side, lower right, there's 3 videos. I think it's one on Restorative Practices and 2 on family group. We do, again, I think structures matter. And so we have a 30-minute carved out in each day where 10 to 15 kids are with 1 or 2 adults, and they meet every single day for 30 minutes. And we talk about social issues and political issues, academic issues. We call it family group. And we went through a pretty intense process for that, and it tells you what we did. So I would say that we introduce this and reinforce. Remember I said you have to introduce, reinforce, maintain, you know, these relationships. So we maintain them through family group. And so I think it holds the students and accountable, and the parents, the students and the adults accountable for maintaining the relationships and for restoring them when things are not going as planned. So again, I would say, I would tell any school district to try to find, it doesn't have to be every single day, try to find time that allows students to connect. Some call it connect time, others call it advisory. But if it's just like a glorified study hall, it defeats the purpose. So like, what are you actually doing to create behavioral health lessons or social emotional lessons that allow kids to really unpack the things that are bothering them, but also learn how to help others heal who may have been impacted.
And also to help each other know when to go to an adult, whether it's going to the adult to make a report or going to adult to get the help that they need. I think that's real important, and peers can help to do that.
Correct.
Okay, so the next question is this whole process done by one person? And how do we ensure the integrity of the investigation? We all have our own bias.
So it depends on the size of the district. So each district is different. Some districts have one DASA coordinator. I saw in the list that Pat shared, there's about 10 or 15 names there, right?
9, 1 at each building, and then me centrally.
All right, yeah. So
We have 9 school buildings, so there are 9.
So the PowerPoint that I shared tonight would be a typical training that all 9 would get consistently, so they can, like I said earlier, in a rater agreement, they have some ideas, some commonality around what's an infraction, what's not. They're also going to train their teachers to make sure they're bringing things up. But I think, we refresh us throughout the year. What I would do is I would say, here's a situation that involved Kevin Spencer's kids, or Kevin Spencer, he's a bad student, as you all know. Like, here's Kevin, situation, and we really could not figure this out. And so let's take a look at Kevin's case. Let's process through it. What would you have done in this situation? Where did I mess up? Where did I miss? Like, sometimes you can do case studies based on certain things with the DASA coordinator. So, I mean, I don't think you're ever going to have it's never going to be an exact, it's never going to be an exact response for the same answer, but it should be within a margin of understanding and agreement.
In our case, we're fortunate in the sense that we have multiple buildings at each level. So the DASA coordinator at Barker Road can talk to the DASA coordinator at Calkins Road at the same level to say, have you ever had this type of situation? And then we also do that scenario building, as well as looking at different things that have happened and saying, how would you respond to this? How did you respond to this? Would I have responded any differently? So it's nice to be able to bring those folks together and have that dialogue. And then we're essentially training each other as well as the required training.
So ultimately, it's whoever the school's coordinator is to make that decision of whether it's DASA or not, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So in our district, just so folks are aware, if there's a report that's made, it goes directly to the building level DASA coordinator, and then it goes directly to me, so that I'm always engaged with that person. And then I can see them across the building, so I'm looking at the entire district and looking for those patterns and looking for the resolutions, and also able to help and support if that's needed at that point.
All right, I think that one answered that one. We have a few more questions, so I'm just gonna keep going. What should a student do if a teacher or staff does not consider their complaint sufficient to trigger a reporting process to the building or district coordinator?
I mentioned it earlier before. A parent always has a right to trigger their own complaint with SED. And so I think there's one of the links I have there. Parents can go right into their own DASA reporting and report it themselves. Again, I would think that would be a last case situation. I think, not that I ever encourage people going to the school board, but I think, the school board is designed to represent the parents of the district, and the school board meetings you can go to, the superintendent. But I would start with the school-based issue first. And if I'm in Pittsford, then if what I got at the school base didn't make me feel satisfied, I would go to Pat. And if Pat doesn't, if you feel like that response wasn't good enough, then I would go to Mike. And if Mike says, we'll go back to Pat, and then you can go to the board. I mean, I hate that you have to go through all these steps to have your issues heard. But ideally, if there's a situation that Pat and the other 8 can talk through together and say, like, what are we missing here? It'll improve practice for the entire district. And I'm only mentioning Pat because this is Pittsford. Same thing in our building. If it was something that was happening, we've done this many, many times, where I've walked out of a meeting and said, that just doesn't feel right. Like that, those number that you gave this kid 4 days for that, like, what is that all about? We'll sit and I will overrule and bring the kid back. I mean, people know that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and other times I'm like, that's all you give them was 4 days? Right? Like, here's the 10th time this has happened, you know? So I think having those honest conversations with one another becomes important. Now, if there's a breakdown in communication internally, then that's Pat has to, in this case, Pittsford, Pat has to address that and be held accountable for that, and by the superintendent or the school board or whomever, but more importantly by the parents. As I started by saying, there are times in which parents come in demanding a certain response, and it doesn't get to that level on this progressive discipline piece. And then somewhere in the middle, it has to be an understanding between why the school made that decision and why the parents feel like it should have been more severe. And you may not walk away agreeing with the outcome, but you should most of the time walk away agreeing with understanding why people made the decision they made and their thinking behind it. You may not agree with it, at least you'll say, well, I don't agree with it, but I understand. Like, that would be the best. That would be a win-win situation.
Mm-hmm. I would like to back up even just a little bit more, that if a student goes to a teacher, and obviously depending on the age of the student, right? So we talk to our middle school and high school students about them filing the report. Our students will file incident reports to be investigated. So they have that agency that they can themselves take action against that. Obviously for younger children, parents can file on behalf of their younger children. There are times where a student will report something to a counselor or administrator or someone else, and that person with the student will file the report. So there's multiple ways that can happen so that the child isn't left alone with their concern. Now, on the back end of that, there might be other trainings and things we need to do, because if someone has information and they have not conceptualized it as rising to the level of bringing it to someone's attention, then I have to go back and address that.
Okay, that answers that one. So the next one is actually Mary Jo's question. It's a little lengthy, so I unmuted her so she can ask. Go ahead, Mary Jo.
Okay, so first of all, huge thank you to the D&I committee for hosting this talk, but as we can all see from the attendee list, it's a very short list. We have a lot of families in our district. Not a lot of people came to this talk. My kids have been involved in some DASA reports, and in my experience, parents are really under-informed about DASA and the process and how the DASA coordinators in the buildings determine what rises to the level of a report, how districts might even be able to control what gets reported to the state, and even the right of students and parents to file a report themselves. And Pat, you answered some of these questions really nicely. But Shaun, in your opinion, what should districts do to really ensure that parents and students and families are informed of these processes and what your rights are? I think that, we have a link on the Pittsford district. All the buildings have a link on their website, which is great. But should we do more to ensure that families get this detailed information year after year? And, really, what can districts do to bring families into a talk like this or a presentation like this so that every student and every family really understands this? As Pat was answering some of the questions about what the presentations are for students, I informally asked my teenage students, do you guys know what DASA is? And they both said, I have no idea what you're talking about. So we may think that we're giving information to kids, but I think most families don't really don't have an understanding of what our rights are.
So I would answer questions you asked me. And that's why I think I intentionally gave you links to other websites, because I thought and here's how I did. I really simply went to districts, the website, in the search tab, put in DASA, and I saw what came up. And there were some sites that it took you to a page, and it took you to another page, and took you to another page, to another page. And those, I would say, would not be the type of websites that would keep parents informed. These websites, I went straight to them, and I felt like I could see that DASA was a priority for them. because that section of their page had tabs and links, and I felt it was very informative. So I'm not saying those are the model districts. I'm not comparing those to Pittsford, but I would say take a look at them. And I think this group, since it surfaced and it's a group that the district obviously knows about and respects, that if you don't think the website mirrors what you all desire, then work with the district to redesign it. I think I would hope the district would be open to that, open to the idea of redesigning the website or making the website more
robust
and accessible for individuals. So that's one way of doing it. I think that's great. I mean, you have this video now, it's recorded. You might take sections of it and share it with parents. Perhaps Pat might put it on their website, whatever, there's many different ways to do this, but I do think that looking at models first, understanding looking at models that represent a balanced perspective on DASA, as well as making information accessible, is important. And I think through social media, you can do really quick 3 to 4 minute clips that you guys can share on your Facebook page or your website to inform parents. Hey, did you know? And this is the law. And here's where you would find this on Pittsford's website. I remember when I was a principal at Rush Henrietta, King Graham, at the time superintendent, he made this was back in the day, he made a video that was, how do you complain to the superintendent? It still may be up there. And it was a quick, 3-minute video, don't come to me first, go to your principal. Principal doesn't come, then go to this person. I don't know how many parents read it or actually watched it, but I thought it was kind of clever. It was just him talking in his office. Although I want to hear from you, make sure you handle your situation in schools first. It could be as short as that. You can have kids make it. I mean, you can get as creative as you want. And if this is something that you all feel is a priority, make that known to Pat and to Mike, and then let them come up with a plan that responds to it. And if they don't, then you do what parents do. You complain and you elevate it. But I think that, and I'm very vocal in my own kids' district. And then I'm going at it with my peer, who's a superintendent also. But I do it in a very respectful way. I challenge him. He challenged me back as a parent. But at the end of the day, I think our collective dissent allows for the district to improve itself, and for other kids whose parents don't know how to complain, they give them a voice to learn how to complain or how to share their issues. So I would say this is a first step, or maybe not. It is a step in the process of bringing more clarity. I really think, Pat, it's our anniversary today, for those who didn't know that, for giving us her night of our anniversary to really put some time together and make this a priority, because it's something that she says she values and she wants to hear from. So although there's not a lot of parents on the call, you might have the right parents on the call who can share lived experiences and will allow Pat to be able to go back and rethink strategy around communication.
And I think that's where the partnership with PTSA can help. What do you know from the parents that you engage with more than I engage with, more than the administrators' engagement in a different way? What venues are helpful to them? Some families like to go on the website, but they don't want to click around a lot. Some don't like to go on the website to go around to get their information. There might be other ways that are more valuable. There might be other ways that we can get more people to participate in an event like this. So having your knowledge of the parents in our community really helps as well. So I agree. Go to Pat.
Yeah. So I'll answer the last 2 questions. I see them. So one question from Mark is, how are DASA and code of conduct related or tied together? So if you look at code of conduct, it's a set of principles and guidelines the district should be using to make its decisions. Code of conduct is typically approved by the school board as policy. And so DASA it would kind of be a marriage within that. So code of conduct might say that students are not subjected to bullying. Then if they're bullied, then the response would be, how does code of DASA may give the guidance on how to respond to that. So code of conduct is policy, if you will. DASA is a process towards handling policy infractions. But both of them, so code of conducts are more district-based. They are somewhat, they can be individualized district to district, if you will, and tailored. Whereas DASA is law, and that's not really tailored. That's the legal standard, if you will. Nahoko asked a question around FERPA. The question was, she said she really appreciates FERPA, but wondering if the perpetrator is not named, is it possible for the school to disclose what may have been the resolution of consequences without violating FERPA? I think it's really, it's a tricky one, because if all the kids know that Nahoko beat me up and she keeps beating me up, and although I don't say it's Nahoko and I say she got 10-day suspension, most people can figure it out. So I would never give a specific infraction or the consequences. I would say to the parent of the kid who got beat up, who's worried, I would say to them that we've dealt with it. There's going to be resolution. If you hear anything else, let us know. But I'll tell you, I would stop short of saying that I can guarantee your child's safety, because you can never do that. So Nahoko has her 5-day suspension. She comes back day 6, punches me in the face again. Parent says, I thought this was resolved. What are you doing? You know, and so sometimes those things happen. And then the progressive discipline might be, all right, the next suspension is the superintendent's hearing that keeps Nahoko out for 20 days. And then she comes back day 21, she hits me again. And then, you know, then eventually gets to whatever the case may be. That does happen in extreme situations. If that does happen, you have to then question what the intervention plan was. Did the kid get proper counseling and support? You know, was the restorative process for bringing the kids back? So how were both kids prepared for that child to re-enter the school? So that's
what was the plan, right?
What was the plan, right? And they have to be held accountable for that plan. All right. So I just wanted to share, if I can, because I wanted to do this, and I want to just to show you all some additional resources, as I said I would, and that is what I shared in the link. This is the Q's website. If you go under by topic and you go to restorative practices, which I'm already linked on, you'll see an article on empowering students. There's a bunch of information we have on the left side, articles that are similar to the topic. We have videos on restorative practices and family group. Then we have some research on the left side also. We do some related research as well for things we've seen nationally. This continues to be added to. So that's something I think you should take a look at. And for the bullying article, we'll make sure we put that into restorative tab as well. This was an article that came out in right before COVID.
Right, it's a good article.
Fighting cyber.
Nicely done, Dr. Nelms.
And it's all Val's of brains. This is May 2020 edition. This just talks about how we reshape school culture, and the full article is here as well. So I just want to thank you all for checking in and listening again. I hope we were able to answer as many questions as possible. It is 8:30. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I'll turn it back over to our host.
We just want to thank everybody for joining us as well, and we will put these up as soon as Mark is able to. He's my tech guy over there. So we'll also have the link to the questions as well, and so people can look at the questions. If there's any additional questions that come up and weren't answered, or you think about later, because that's what I do, just email us and we can share them with Dr. Nelms and Dr. Brogan and get you guys answers.
Great.
Those as well. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and this was awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.